Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with whole grain blueberry scones. That's right, I had some gorgeous blueberries which I wanted to use in something very delicious, but I couldn't decide whether I wanted to use these in a muffin, a scone, or a donut. So I ended up doing something that's kind of a combination of all three. In fact, I almost portmanteaued this into something called a muff scone nut. But then I was told by my search engine consultants that muff scone nut is not a super popular internet search. So we're just going to call it a whole grain blueberry scone, and this is how you put it together. All right, so for the dough, we're going to need some whole grain flour, and I'm using something called sprouted spelt flour, which you may remember from such videos as spelt pizza dough. And as usual, I'll give more info about this on the blog, but this stuff is just a wonderful all-purpose flour, and not only is it high in protein, but it's also very light and mild tasting for a whole grain. And then to that, we're going to add some baking powder, as well as baking soda. We're also going to need a little bit of salt, of course. And then because I did want these to have a little bit of old-fashioned donut to them, we're going to do a little pinch of nutmeg, freshly grated, of course, as well as a little pinch of cinnamon. And then just because it goes so well with blueberries, I decided to grate in a little lemon zest. And that's basically it for the dry ingredients. And as usual, we'll take a whisk and we'll mix that thoroughly, mostly to make sure everything's nicely combined and we don't have any chunks of baking powder or baking soda hiding anywhere. And then once that's mixed, we have a little decision to make, whether or not you want to add a little sugar. So my feeling is if you're making these for like a weekday breakfast treat, then I probably wouldn't add any. But if you're going for something that's a little closer to a special occasion pastry, then I would go ahead and add a couple tablespoons, which is what I'm doing here, since I am going to pass this off as a Mother's Day brunch idea. And once that's set, we can move on to the incredibly important step of cutting in the butter. Except we're not going to cut it in as usual, we're going to grate it in. So what you want to do before you start this is put a stick of butter in the freezer, and then we're going to use a cheese grater to grate that butter into the flour mixture. And basically that's going to give us the same little pieces of butter that we would get using a pastry blender or pastry cutter for this. So this technique does work very well, but one tip, every couple tablespoons or so, take your fork and kind of toss those grated pieces of butter into the flour so they don't clump together. And we'll just continue doing that until all the butter's grated in. So as long as you don't slip and grate a fingernail off, oh man, that's the worst. This really is a fantastic technique. So our butter's been cut in, quote unquote, and we can proceed, but because my fork doesn't have any nerve endings in it, I wanted to give this a double check with my fingers, and if the mixture seems a little coarse, in other words, the butter pieces might be too big, you can just rub it between your fingers like this to break it down a little more, but mine felt pretty good. So at that point, I was ready to grab my blueberries and add those in, and we'll give those a quick toss before adding our liquid, which in this case is buttermilk. And then all we want to do is take our fork and give this a mix until it just comes together. Okay, usually at this point we'd form a dough ball and then roll it out and cut our scones, but I much prefer to do my dough forming right on the work surface. So as soon as it comes together like this, I'm going to transfer that onto my table, and we'll kind of smush and push and press this all together. And all we're trying to do here is to get this into some kind of rough rectangular shape. And fair warning, because we did not mix this all the way in the bowl, you're going to have some spots that are wet and sticky, and other spots are going to be dry and crumbly, but that's totally normal. Just relax. Just keep pushing, patting, and pressing until you have something that looks like this, at which point we're going to take our bench scraper, and we're basically going to give this a tri-fold. So we'll get under with our scraper and fold that third over, and then we'll fold the other third over the top, and then we'll turn it and again press it back into a rectangular shape. And any of those rogue crumbs you see, you can just press into the dough, no problem. And I don't think we want to press this too thin. So mine was probably 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches thick. So like I said, we're going to form that back into a rectangle, at which point we're ready to cut our scones. So first I'm going to cut this in half, and then in half the other way to make 4 rectangles. And then each of the 4 rectangles we will cut in half diagonally to make triangles. Which if you take your time and do this evenly, like I definitely did not, you should get some beautiful right angle triangles. Mine were a little more isosceles than I would have liked. But hey, this is home ec, not geometry, am I right? And besides, who the heck wants to eat a perfect scone? That's not a good look. And then once those are cut, we're going to transfer those onto some kind of lined baking sheet. I like to use the Silpat, but I'm sure parchment paper would work. And if we wanted, we could pop these in the oven right now, and they would look pretty good. But we generally don't like to settle for pretty good. We want these to look stunning. So to help us achieve that, we're going to paint the tops with a little extra buttermilk. All right, a nice generous application on top of each one. And once that's been brushed on, we will finish with a little bit of granulated sugar. And what I like to use is something called Demerara sugar, which has a nice big crystal. And not only is that going to look incredible, it's going to give it a beautiful crunch. And yes, of course, you can just use regular sugar if you want. I mean, you're the Andrew Bogut of what we almost called a muff scone nut. So that's up to you. Both will work beautifully. And then once those have been sugared, we can go ahead and transfer those into the center of a preheated 425-degree oven for about 25 minutes, or until they look like this. They should basically look like one of the most beautiful baked things you've ever seen. And of course, as Murphy's Law would have it, there must have been a large cluster of fruit in the tip of that smallest scone, which caused what we call in the business a blueberry blowout. But that was no big deal. I just fixed it by biting that piece off. And then, of course, the bad news as usual. Let these cool down before you eat them. Okay, fine. You can try one when they're a little warm. But you really do want to let those cool down on the pan at least 15 or 20 minutes. At which point we can transfer onto a plate and dig in. And as gorgeous as I think these look, the taste and texture was just as good. Right, they had this beautiful, flaky, crispy, crusty exterior. And then the inside had a very light, very tender texture. It was just moist enough. And as I mentioned earlier, that little bit of spice we added gives these blueberry scones just a little hint of old-fashioned donut, which I think elevated these into something a little extra special. And of course, if there happened to be an occasion or holiday coming up where serving someone breakfast in bed would be appropriate, like Mother's Day, for example, these would be perfect. But anyway, that's it. Whole grain blueberry scones. So whether you're going to make these to finally impress someone in bed, or you're just going to whip up a batch for a delicious weekday breakfast treat, I really hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.